Welcome to this episode of Logos and this special series of historical constitution, Jovellanos Burke, Burke Jovellanos, and how this idea of the historical constitution has evolved a long time. This is the question that I would like to answer in this last episode, specifically understanding the two different cases of England and also the US and Spain and South America, the Philippines, Central America. In the case of England, we have to understand that it's a key moment for them, for the English nation, the 1789 French Revolution, because it was putting into doubt to some extent the traditional political regime. Traditional to some extent because we remember the glorious revolution of the mid 1600s that was already a revolution that took place before the French Revolution in England. So some people say that modernity didn't start with the 1789 revolution but with the 1668 glorious revolution. But that's another topic. Then the 1789 French Revolution was putting into doubt the English political system. That system of two houses, of limited monarchy, although that was going to evolve a long time, that was the idea already in 1789. After the death of Edmund Burke, England was not reviewing his texts until the 1860s, 1870s, when the conservative political movement started to write about Edmund Burke. But they were not talking about the ancient constitution. They were talking about the ideas of Edmund Burke, and they were thinking of what Edmund Burke was reflecting in 1790 in his reflections on the revolution in France. And it was not until the 1910s, 1920s when Edmund Burke was enshrined as the most important and the basis of the English political thought in the conservative domain. And was mainly the conservative tradition in English political thought that adopted Edmund Burke and in extenso as a consequence the idea of the ancient revolution, ancient constitution. But was the United States of America the one in the 1950s to accept and adopt Edmund Burke's ideas as a key element in order to fight communism? In the 1950s, the conservative political thinkers understood that Edmund Burke was a thinker that was talking about private property, was talking about civil society, and in the end was talking about the power of the person, the power of the family, the power of civil society against a totalitarian state. So the Asian Constitution was there in the 1950s in the United States of America and survived to some extent until the new the new conservative movement with Russell Kirk um, did a major work in order to restore Edmund Burke as a major political thinker in the conservative movement and the conservative political thought. And what is the situation nowadays with the idea of historical constitution, of ancient constitution in the English speaking world? And are politicians talking about? Do we have books? So nowadays, the idea of the historical constitution is not having a primordial role in the English speaking world. However, it's also true that the ideas of Edmund Burke and his reflections on the Revolution of France are still relevant to our days. And the English-speaking conservative mm, thought is still driving around or working on those ideas. Let's talk about the Spanish case, Spain and also Latin America. What has happened with Jovellanos' idea of historical constitution? Well, in the first place, the idea of historical constitution was to some extent enshrined in the 1812 Cadiz Constitution. That was the first liberal constitution in a Spanish-speaking world, and was one of the first ones, also the first one, in fact, to accept the universal suffrage with a major caveat, because it gave rights of representation to Native Americans, mestizos, and peninsulares, people from the peninsula living in America, in the Philippines, in Africa. However, this constitution didn't give rights of participation, rights of political rights to African Americans. The main argument was because they were not natural from those from America. In that way, the 1812 Spanish Constitution was a liberal constitution in the sense that it was extending and expanding rights for a large part of the population, but at the same time was accepting the historical constitution, accepting the inheritance from other periods. But that was abolished in 1817 with Ferdinand VII, and then it was not until 1837 that the idea of introducing tradition within a modern political framework was not important in the Spanish political context. In fact, it was not until 1845 that Donoso Cortés wrote the preamble of the Estatuto Real of 1845, and he talked about the preservation of the historical constitution. That's a direct link from 1811 Jovellanos to 1845 Donoso Cortés. Donoso Cortés, as we know, he's a character that shifts from a liberal to a conservative and finally traditional perspective of politics. And that's why, to some extent, we could say that the historical constitution in Spain has two main promoters. On the one hand, the traditional political thinkers or traditional political thought, and on the other hand, the conservative or liberal conservative. And here we can find in 1876 um, Cánovas del Castillo. Cánovas del Castillo introduces the idea of constitución interna. The constitución interna, it's a reimagination of the idea of the ancient constitution, la constitución histórica. In this way, the idea of historical constitution in Spain is preserved per se, more than in England or the English-speaking world. However, after the 1800s, in Spain, the idea of the historical constitution is not important. Not until 1978, with the last Spanish constitution, in which we can see maybe some threats coming from the 1812 Cadiz Constitution, and in that way, there's a historical connection. However, that would be a topic for another episode. And nowadays, in 2026, what's the situation of the historical constitution in Spain or on the Hispanic world? So it's not a major question of debate in the academia. It's not a political innovation. However, it could bring some lights in order to understand, for example, the constitutional processes in America, in what used to be the Hispanic America, and also it could bring some light in order to understand some of the challenges that maybe Spain is facing regarding uh, its national identity. Thank you very much for listening, and thanks also to the Institute for Humane Studies, and also the Department of Politics and International Studies of the University of Cambridge.